Hey, Paul, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, you have a long story that I'm looking forward to diving into. And as I was just saying to you before we hit the record button, you are an entrepreneur in a fairly technical space, or have been. I discovered you through Indie Hackers, actually. You were doing an Ask Me Anything there, and you were talking about your past success with Circle and then currently with Dark Lang. You're very much in engineer programming cloud space. Rather than me attempt to explain the summary of what you have done and what you currently are working on, do you want to give us just the broad strokes overview of your two most well-known companies now?
For sure, for sure. So CircleCi is it is the biggest CI company, and CI stands for continuous integration, but that word doesn't really mean anything, and it certainly doesn't mean what it used to mean, so it's sort of complicated. But basically what that does is developer workflow automation. So you have the code on your machine. When you're working on something, you need to get that code into the cloud where your customers can use it. And CI/CD is the process of doing that, and just making sure that like it is safely tested and deployed and packaged and whatever else it is you do en route to the cloud.
Okay, so I know I'm going to ask you this when we hit this part of your story, but I would like to clarify right now. What was the innovation that you, right at the start of the Circle story, saw? Because I understand cloud in the sense that technology moved from sort of you owning your own box in a server room to a sort of massive shared cloud-based interface, and the apps kind of moved to a more dispersed sort of, even now I'm stumbling here, but a more general dispersed kind of software application layer. But I understand with coding, having had a startup, had engineers, they were sitting there they were building things, but the testing was all kind of done, I guess, locally on their own machine, and then they would upload it, and we'd see if it worked online. That was kind of like the rough version of how we did it. So what's the difference between what I'm saying versus what you guys did with Circle?
So what people would do is one of two things before Circle. So one is that they would just, as you say, test it locally and then deploy it into production. And what would happen in that case is that sometimes developers didn't have everything set up in exactly the right way for production. Maybe they forgot to check in a file or something like that. So their tests were actually run against something that was different from what runs in production, and tests would break. And so that's sort of the one sort of like collaboration innovation that it brings is everything is always run in the same place, in the same way, and there's no worked on my machine, didn't work on your machine, didn't work in production. Right. The other thing is very much that move to the cloud. So the companies that did do CI and that had like a build server, they could only run one thing on it at once, and they might have a team that was growing. They also couldn't like split it out and run it across like dozens of these machines. And so very much like one of the innovations is just like, take this thing that was run in your office on a server, and have it run in the cloud instead. And so you don't need to buy a build server. You don't need to set up a build server. You just like connect your GitHub, literally one click, and then your CI just runs. And so that was a very big innovation for people who often didn't have CI/CD. So in 2011 when we started, people had only just really gotten on board with GitHub a couple of years earlier, and everyone was like had only just agreed that we're going to use source control for everything. And so setting up CI was just a very big process for people, and they wouldn't do it. And so when they saw, oh, there's a cloud thing, I can get it set up in seconds, that really was a night and day shift for them. Okay.
And I just want to clarify too, why is it a big issue to set that up yourself versus, is it because you need to set up a massive testing environment in order to, and then that's kind of like wasted effort because it might not really be a great testing environment?
So, apart from the fact that you have to buy a computer and then you have to install the software, the most common CI software at the time was an open source tool called Jenkins. So you had to set that up. And then you had to install the databases and install the OS and install all the dependencies and get everything in sort of like the right shape. So typically it would take people about 2 days to do that. Versus in Circle, it would often run about 35% of the time it would work automatically on the first go without you having to do anything. And it took a year of very much tweaking what we were doing to get it to that stage. And in the 60% of cases where it didn't quite run on the first go, there were relatively small tweaks that we could tell you how to do or that you could do to make that work.
Okay. And I do want to connect the dots with how you came up with this idea in terms of the point we were in your life too, because I can imagine that was a different space to when we're talking now in 2021.
My God,
yeah. So before we do go back in time though, how big is CircleCi right now?
Maybe 700 people, I think. Wow. The last fundraise that was announced relatively recently was 100 million at like a 1.7 billion valuation, something along those lines.
Okay, and you as you left the company, but you're still heavily involved. You said
I wouldn't say heavily involved. I'm on the board, and I'm the board member who actually uses the product.
Okay, that's an important board member.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, obviously huge success, and this is a very technical aspect, I feel, of entrepreneurship. Some of my other guests can be simpler to explain the idea because it's, like, for example, recently had a guest who was like the Uber for lawn care. It's people need their lawns mowed. You open up an app or a website, right. You find a lawn mower, away you go. Your story, a little different, a little more technical, but I appreciate you, taking the time to answer some of those questions. And obviously I will have some more for you. But before we go more technical, let's get more personal. Can we go back in time? Where were you born and raised?
So I'm Irish. I was born in Dublin. I was raised in Geneva, in Dublin, and in Westchester County, New York. My dad was a diplomat, so we traveled around. So I was sort of 5 years in each before eventually ending up in boarding school in Dublin, and then going to college in Dublin as well.
Okay, now Ireland. Now, as I say, talk about the country. It's actually not uncommon to think it could be a place for technical entrepreneurship. I think of the Coulson boys with Stripe coming from there. At the time growing up, did you see any local kind of influence for entrepreneurship or any influence for entrepreneurship even overseas as a young person?
I think didn't particularly see a whole lot of startup stuff in Ireland.
Okay.
Certainly there was some stuff. I had a cousin that did something interesting during the dotcom, and my uncle had a software company. So I wasn't completely separated from it. But when I moved to San Francisco, it was very very much night and day between the two. I remember thinking, when I got to San Francisco and Silicon Valley, that people actually cared about tech and startups and software. Whereas, in Dublin at the time, all of the interest was in, legal and, finance and construction or real estate were the big sort of booming industries. And you told people you were a software engineer and no one really gave a shit.
Mm-hmm. So did you have interest in software engineering from day one? Like you were a 12-year-old with your first basic programming language coding software?
Not exactly that. I mean, I certainly did I did a coding course when I was 7 or something, and I
wow.
Kept that up and a little bit, not all that much, and then kind of got into video games and played video games for a while, and that turned into PC gaming, and then I was building my computer and optimizing it to get the last inch of I think at the time it was conventional memory or something like that to run the games, and so that sort of was where my re-interest in computers came, and I thought I was going to do computer engineering in college, and the degree that I did had a hardware component. But once I started coding, I was just oh yeah, this is the shit. I love coding.
Now, I for a very brief period of time in my university studies, thought I would also get into coding because I saw it as the future. I tasted JavaScript and realized, oh my God, my brain is just not built for understanding, the logic-based programming. So I stuck with business school and dropped out of the programming side. For yourself, obviously, your brain was like, I love this. I can make this work. Can you maybe take yourself back to that, I guess it was university sort of studies when you were going deeper into software? What were you most excited about doing? Like, did you see yourself becoming a software engineer, Silicon Valley lifestyle, or is this more like something you see like, oh, I'd love to build an app that does this? It's more practical, more hands-on. Like, what excited you?
I mean, I would say that we didn't have great visibility into like the Silicon Valley lifestyle kind of thing. Like in Dublin, there's when I was doing my degree, or coming to the end of my degree at least, the dotcom bubble had popped, and we weren't really aware of it anyway. It hadn't like really permeated in the way that that it has today. So for me, it was just like really liked coding. I had always been entrepreneurial. I was always interested in business as well. I'd considered doing business degree and that kind of thing. But for me, it was really about like building software, and in particular, the thing that I really enjoyed was the part of our degree that focused on compilers, which is sort of the developer tools, basically, which is what both CircleCi and Darklang are quite related to, and it's what I ended up doing my PhD in as well.
Oh wow! So you did a PhD. So you went from undergrad to postgrad straight through?
So undergrad, started a company, quit the company, postgrad, then Y-Combinator, then Mozilla, then CircleCi, and then Dark.
Okay. Yeah. I have questions.
Bit of a journey.
Okay, so just quickly, the company you started, was that while you were doing undergrad, did you say? Was that a startup?
No, it was six of us started right after undergrad. Okay. They kept doing it for about 3 years, but I found relatively quickly that I disagreed with all of the decisions. And so after a few months, it was like, all right, I'm going to go back and do my postgrad.
Okay. So just curious, what was the idea for that business? What were they doing? There wasn't so much an idea. It was more do consulting, build a nest egg, and then like figure out what they wanted to build. And I was gone long before that happened. So more like an agency dev consulting kind of
something along
solution.
those lines.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So you come back and you do postgrad. Postgrad was straight into PhD.
Yep. The way it's done around you sort of have the master's part covered in your undergrad. It's sort of. So the PhD was like 4 years.
Okay. So was that also in the world of compilers? Did you have that was thesis in mind?
So my PhD is in compilers and static analysis. Static analysis is about looking at the code as code, like analyzing the text of the code, basically. So I did a compiler for PHP is what I did. PHP is a programming language, and it's a dynamic language and doesn't really have a compiler. And so I did a bunch of research into, how that dynamicism works and how you can optimize it anyway.
Okay. I'm curious. I understand there's levels of engineers, programmers, your junior, your senior. Mm-hmm. When you were doing your PhD, and right away, that's a choice to be an academic programmer too, not I'm building something that's going to be commercialized, at least at that point, I assume. Where did you see, did you see yourself, forgive me if I'm being, overly flattering, but did you see yourself as a genius level programmer at that point? Or how did you compare yourself? Because I see this also as an opportunity cost decision to start a PhD. You could have potentially been hired if you were a very good engineer, I assume, for over six figures, if not, 200, 300,000 a year, depending on your skill set at that time.
It was a different time. That is not the case at all. So in Ireland, after my undergrad, I was making 31K. Wow. That was euro, and that was a great salary. Like my friends were making 28. And I had an internship in London before that. And if I'd gone to London, I could have been making, 40K. I was very unaware of how much people made in Silicon Valley. And that was not at all a thing that was, it wasn't actually a thing that was that interesting to me either. What was interesting about Silicon Valley is that that's where all the good compiler research was being done. So it's actually hard to get a job in compilers outside of academia. There aren't that many places that do interesting stuff there, and there started to be a lot more, but I imagined that I would end up, at something like Google working on, let's say Chrome or, Facebook or Apple. They all have kind of like large and interesting compiler projects. But there's not that much of that going around. So I imagined I'd move to California just to be working in the industry I was interested in.
Okay, so that was your thought process as what happens next after my PhD is over?
Yeah, I mean, when I was deciding what to do, I was looking at this site called compilerjobs.net, I think. And all of the things required PhDs, and that's why I did my PhD. I thought like, oh, I need this. It turns out that that wasn't true, but that's what I thought at the time.
Interesting. It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, the compiler aspect of engineering and programming, it's a niche.
It is certainly a niche, yeah.
Right.
And so it's a niche that there's very few like startups around it. Kind of a lot of my career has been sort of like tricking investors to fund my niche compiler startup.
I'm curious about that too, but before we get to the investment part.
Both of them, like, CircleCi and Dark, they're both sort of like niche compiler things in their own little ways.
Yeah, and I can imagine like having to describe the market opportunity and, is the TAM there? Would almost you'd need investors who are very technical themselves to kind of understand what, again, it's not like lawnmower, Uber for lawnmowers here. It's,
and with Circle, like I really struggled to describe that, Sam. Like I had no idea how big Circle could be. I said recently it was, worth 1.7 billion. Yeah. I was hoping one day it might be worth 100 million. And like, that would have been fantastically, successful by my mind. And, I couldn't see what, where Circle is now. I couldn't describe to investors a world where we make as much money as we do and the company is as big as it is.
Yeah, amazing. Well, let's go forward with your story then. So you complete your PhD, and can we timestamp this too? Because I'm guessing it's post dotcom bubble one.
Yeah.
So we're kind of
so
like.
I finished my undergrad in 2004. I started my PhD in late 2005. Finished it in late 2009. Y-Combinator was early 2010.
Well, let's talk about that then. I'd love to dive into the. So you finished your PhD. Did you have an idea for a startup straight away?
I did, of course. I'd been thinking about it for ages. My blog had bad commenting software and it needed better commenting software. And so that was literally what the startup was. And after, sort of thinking about the good commenting software that was out there, and I particularly looking at like Hacker News and Reddit and things that actually, allowed good conversation to happen despite all the trash. I thought of it as community software. And who has a community problem? Well, newspapers. They need to like adapt into this like community thing. Right now, their comment sections are complete trash. So I thought we would sell to newspapers, and that's sort of the naivety of trying to sell to people who have no money at all and no interest in what you're doing. And so that didn't last very long.
Right. Yeah, not the best target audience at that time.
Not at all, no.
And I'm thinking, too, 2009, we're talking the great financial crisis sort of happened and was sort of finishing up around then. And then there was that kind of, what they call it, like a dark period for raising capital. There wasn't many people willing to invest back then.
Absolutely. There was, in my batch, I think one company raised a seed round of like $750,000, maybe two or three of them did. But, most of us just, we're putting together very small rounds of, a couple of $100K. In our case, just $50K.
Wow.
and there just was not a lot of money going around. It's nothing like now, but even 2 years later when I raised for CircleCi, that was a completely different world as well.
Okay, so just for the Y-Combinator story, you took that comment idea into Y-Combinator. Did you have like a co-founder with you at that time as well?
I had a co-founder, and we went in. It was the four of them back in the day, and the thing that I think allowed us to get in is that we had done this analysis of this big long comment thread in The Guardian. And the thread was like, completely linear. There's no like threading or that sort of thing. And so people would say each other's name to refer back to someone's comments, like, 50 comments ago or whatever. And so we did analysis of this, and we created this like pretty tree, and like talking about like, look, here's one comment thread, here's another comment thread. And they were all looking at that. They're like, oh my God, these nerds put a graph onto something, social. It's like, we must fund this. At least that's how I imagine it went.
Plus, you had obviously strong technical competency, which is always a plus getting into YC as well. Yeah, I can imagine this is also prior to commenting, like just say on Facebook pages and posts. Nowadays, it's just expected. You tag a name, you write a comment, like you said, Reddit.
Yeah.
It's sort of standard.
Things were a bit more primitive then.
Yeah. Okay. And I started in the blogging space too, and I do remember WordPress plugins for comments. It was a problem dealing with spam, and you wanted those kind of threaded features and so on. So not necessarily, you can understand why they said yes. Like I can see that, the potential there. So take us forward. You go into Y-Combinator. Now, if I read correct in your AMA and Indie Hackers, you also got kicked out of Y-Combinator. Was this just the?
That was much more recent. That was like okay. That was like 3 months ago. If even.
All right, we'll get there. So that first time you got in and did the whole program, got to the point where you pitched in front of investors.
Yeah. Did demo day. Didn't go all that well. We still had the sort of like Irishness to us, that sort of self-deprecating. I remember I was standing next to a guy in our batch, and he's pitching an investor. He's saying, this is going to be $1 billion business. And I was saying, something along the lines of, well, most startups fail, and then, probably this one will too. But I think it's a good idea. I think we have a good shot. But yeah, wasn't,
didn't quite get big
not
investors.
Quite the right strategy for American investors.
No, fair enough. It's funny though. Now the irony is, it's almost expected and not believed when you're saying we're going to be $1 billion company.
Right.
But take us forward then with that idea. So you did raise 50,000, you said. So was that enough to at least come up with, MVP version 1.0 and continue?
So yeah, we did an MVP off off our first like 20K. That Y-Combinator had given us, and we did a launch, and then we completely botched the launch. It ended up being more of a news destination site in the end, and we had 30 journalists who were like putting content onto it, but we really had no idea how to do that. We sort of we botched the launch and didn't have any idea how to like get traffic and that kind of thing. And the end result was about a month after the launch, I quit. I was just like, I don't know how to do this. I don't think we can do this. We should, give the money back. And my co-founder wanted to continue it, but then 2 weeks or something afterwards, he was like, also, okay, I'm going to go. This isn't working either.
Okay. So that one kind of had a soft death.
Soft and pretty quick death. But the interesting thing about building things in the journalism space is that journalists will not let you forget it. They will not let you like slink away quietly with your tail between your legs. They will have write-ups about like how terrible you are and what idiots you are and all that sort of thing.
Okay, so you had a few nights Googling your name and reading.
Oh my, yeah, no, it was terrible. Like,
okay,
really, like a month or two of just like very unpleasantness.
Wow. The internet can be cruel. How did you recover from that? Was it a case of let's dive into another startup, or was your mind even thinking, let's go get a job at Google? Where were you at?
Yeah, so I had been talking to Mozilla at the time. They had before I got into Y-Combinator, I was interviewing with Mozilla and Facebook and Google, and I'd cancelled the Google and the Facebook interviews because got into Y-Combinator, but I had gotten an offer from Mozilla, and so they were like, well, just keep that offer. Most companies fail. And so when I was done, I was just like, all right, I'll take this Mozilla offer. This is a great offer. And I will just be a compiler engineer again, which is exactly what I did for another year.
Okay. Mozilla, now I'm trying to think it in 2010, roughly when you were joining, not exactly at the forefront of like they used to be in the sort of, early 2000s. So
it was at the point where it was clear that Chrome was winning.
Right.
And that was known for about a year, I think, at that point. Okay. And so there was not a lot of internal understanding on that. It was known, but it was a time where we're building a browser, we'll make it faster, whatever.
Okay. I am curious. I mean, I take it for granted that Chrome is kind of like the default browser now, but why did Chrome kind of win out at that time? From your perspective.
I think it was faster. I think it was quite considerably faster.
Okay. Speed matters. So does your experience in Mozilla connect in any way with Circle, or is it just a job until you came up with the idea?
So it is where I came up with the idea. We had this effectively a CI system at Mozilla. Every time you pushed code, it would run on dozens of machines, maybe hundreds of machines, and they had a 16-person team, I think, keeping that running. And from an infrastructure side, it was fine, but from a product side, it was terrible to use. And it was hard to figure out why, if something wasn't working and it worked on your machine, but it didn't work on, the Windows machine over there, that was really hard to figure out why. And that was directly inspirational into building Circle.
Okay. So was that a case of you sitting in your desk at Mozilla, you're working, you spot this need in the market, you're thinking there's a business here, do you think, do I try to get back into Y-Combinator round 2, or what was and how do you decide to take that seriously too versus just stay with this safe job?
Well, conveniently, I got fired at around the same time. So that sort of led to what am I going to do next? And there was a couple of options. I was certainly interviewing through, a bunch of Y-Combinator companies and Dropbox, and I was talking to Stripe and lots of things there where if things had gone differently, I might have ended up completely differently. But I just was interested in doing the startup again, and sort of getting back on that horse. And I had talked to a couple of people who about this idea about I don't think I was calling it CI at the time, but something along those lines, automatically running tests and that kind of thing. And that was mid 2011, I think. And then, it didn't take me very long to decide to do it and to start looking for co-founders then.
So here's where I'm going to ask you to kind of help us with the technical side of this. Mm-hmm. When you have an idea that is very much for programmers, this is not front-facing consumer, this is for the engineers in the background, right? What does an MVP look like for them? What do you feel you need to create in order to validate whether this actually is something people want? Mm-hmm. And also, just to sort of extend that question, how do you think about monetization as well? Because I realize with a lot of software, especially on the commercial side, it's often let's build it, grow a user base, we'll figure out money later. Yeah. Is that the similar way of thinking for, an internal software for software engineers kind of business?
I think... So there's this idea that developers don't pay for software, and there is a little bit of truth to that, and certainly there was a lot more truth to it. I think it's much less true now. But certainly having software that you have to pay for inhibits growth and limits who will use it and who will pay for it. And I think that the secret that we discovered, and that a lot of people discovered around the same time, is that people pay for infrastructure. People expect to pay for infrastructure. So if you can make your product free or freemium or available free for open source or something along those lines, to get people to use it and to try it, they will. And, then you charge them for effectively CPU time, which is a thing that they actually expect to do, because everyone knows that if you got stuff running in the cloud, you have to pay for that.
Okay. So does Amazon kind of get credit for like making that standard as a business model, or is it even before them?
I think even before that, before there was Amazon, there were VPCs, there was, colos and all that sort of thing. I think it was relatively established that you would pay people monthly for software, but certainly Amazon blew it up. And in the sort of the part of the world where I was, the people who were building startups, it was really Heroku who was the model that everyone was looking at. Even though Heroku itself was built on AWS, most of the people were paying Heroku for, I think they call them dynos, but essentially some amount of compute power. And so that was the thing that we were, that people were looking at when looking at our pricing.
Okay, so what was your MVP then for Circle?
It was a fully working product. The first version of it would spin up an AWS instance every time to run your code on. And that turned out to be a terrible idea, because spinning up an instance at the time was very slow, and the instances themselves were very slow. And so the sort of I don't know if you'd call it a pivot, the technical change that we had to make at the time was that there's a technology that would eventually become called Docker, or become popularized as Docker. But we were using the version before there was Docker, which was called LXC, Linux containers. And so it was like to adapt our software to use this technology, Linux containers, that allowed us to start builds immediately, and to just run lots of big machines that builds would start immediately on, instead of spinning up a new machine every time.
Okay, so can we first of all, you had a team, like you had a co-founder?
This was me and my co-founder at this stage. For the first
how
year
did you? Is it a friend of yours or?
No, we actually both pitched the same guy with the same idea. Yeah, no, this other guy in my Y-Combinator batch had been staying on my couch, and I was like pitching him the idea, and then he goes back to Austin, and my co-founder Alan Roner pitched him, went to the local entrepreneur local Y-Combinator entrepreneur, and pitched them on the idea. And I got a call from this guy Lloyd, and he's like, this guy is pitching me the exact thing that you're making, and you guys should talk.
And that sounds like a blind date where you both want the same thing.
Yeah, and I think we did a small amounts of sort of due diligence on each other, and but then we just kind of gave it a shot. It was sort of like dating at the start of the pandemic. You just you seem fine. Let's move in together.
Okay. Yeah, it's a big commitment. Did you guys build the whole company together? Who is this person? This your actual...
So his name's Alan, and we worked together for about 2.5 years. Okay. And certainly we were, at that point we were at over $1 million revenue, probably $1.5 million, $2 million revenue at the time that he left.
So with you and Alan starting it, were you both engineers? You both were going to...
We're both engineers. So I did most of the front end and the UX. He did all the cloudy stuff and making that work.
So, okay. And was Lloyd your first investor, or was he someone?
No, he was one of our first customers though.
Okay.
Yeah. But he had said I would use this at my company, and he did.
Okay, I'm curious about that, but let me first answer the investment question. Did you, from day one, go find investors, since you both need to pay yourselves?
For the first while, we were financing it basically out of my pocket. I had some savings, a recent inheritance, not that much. I think there was $100K in the bank, and that needed to pay for myself, and I was married at the time, and she couldn't work for visa reasons. So financing a relatively expensive San Francisco life, and a little bit financing my co-founder while he was because he wasn't working at the time either. And then we managed to raise $50K from an investor, and between that we made it basically a whole year on that, and then the cloud costs started getting a little out of hand, and we needed to actually raise.
Okay. Before we talk about the raise, I'm curious. So that first year, obviously, it sounds like you're successful if your cloud costs are going up. How did you get your first clients?
So that investor who gave us the $50K, so his name's Jonathan Siegel, and he had just bought this company called Exceptional and this other company called Airbrake, and was sort of like combining them. And basically, he just reached out to his customer base and saying, "We're building this thing." And actually, it's funny, but before we met him, he was actually building a competitive CI thing and invested in us instead. But he pitched his customers, and so his customers, we got our first 20 to certainly our first 20 customers were all his customers. Maybe the first 50. And just while we were in private beta, we were just like signing up these customers.
And again, I'm going to lean on my lack of technical understanding here, or lean on your ability to explain it to me. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine your first investor, he happens to own two businesses that had a technical audience who could be your potential customers. Mm-hmm. So he first, I assume, test you guys out, make sure your platform does what it's supposed to do. It does. Mm-hmm. It's great. He feels confident enough to then go to his audience and say, "Hey, if you need, a compiling environment for testing, this is the new cloud-based service." Mm-hmm. I guess it was called CircleCi right from the start.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yep. Go try it out. You guys probably had a website from that point, and then sure, they create a free account. They, I'm assuming, are paying for usage. So it could be a small company. They run their first test. It might cost them 10 cents or something like that. And then
we ended up paying, charging, I think, $20 a month for people to start with. Yeah.
So there was a base fee.
Yeah. So we charged on the idea of how many simultaneous builds you were running at the same time. And we figured that, cost wise, that sort of worked out about the same. Initially, we tried to actually charge people on the basis of users, and the idea that users and your build costs would be roughly similar in some way. And customers didn't actually like that. Like developers, I think don't like the idea of paying per user. That's different now, but at the time that was certainly the case. So we just kind of like rounded it. And tried to figure out a pricing where the price sort of stayed the same as the per user, and the number of builds that you run at the same time is sort of related to that. So we ended up first one is $20, everyone after that is $50, and we had customers on that pricing go the whole way up to paying us like $1 million a year.
Wow. Okay, not from day one, I assume, but
not from day one. It was still like it was relatively quick to our first let's say 12,000 a month, took 6 months.
Wow. So 12,000 a month is a lot of money to invest, and in a company that was, I presume, under 12 months old when you're starting to get that kind of customer base. Mm-hmm. What was it like? Again, I'm going back to this idea. Are you a genius at what you do, Paul, where you could build an MVP that was ready to go for a $12,000 customer that quickly? Because we had $12,000 a month in MRR 6 months after our first paying. But it wasn't one customer paying $12,000, but still, the fact. Okay, but I mean, I guess comes from my. I know how to write a blog post. Mm-hmm. I know what it takes to build a website. But when it comes to a software application, I can't judge a 1 week project versus a 12-month project in terms of the difficulty to create. So I don't really know what version 1.0 of CircleCi, how complex that was, how technically challenging it was. I assume it was somewhat, because otherwise someone else would have done it. before you.
So as it turns out, dozens of people built CI at the same time, or a year before or a year after. It's the sort of thing where developers think, oh, this is actually going to be easy, and so you saw lots of like landing pages of CI that people built in a weekend, often that looked much better than ours, and it turned out that the overall concept of we're going to run some commands in a clean environment is really not challenging. What turned out to be like really difficult was actually getting it to work for customers the first time. So it was really a customer discovery kind of thing where we'd have customers come in and we'd talk to them and we'd like keep an eye on their builds and we'd watch them and we'd set it up for them. And we ended up that the whole, the product was very much a series of hacks on top of hacks on top of hacks as we figured out what went wrong with various different customers. And it was, just a year of sort of expanding out who we were able to address. So at the start, it only worked for Ruby on Rails customers. Then we expanded it to support Node, support Python, PHP, and eventually, Go and all these other things. But they were not, all that easy to do at the start. And, it was really that MVP was about focusing on Ruby on Rails.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense to me. Like, it sounds like before, it's almost like you create this magic test environment where you can put anything into it and test. But truth be told, that really is like not a day one MVP.
Right.
Like, first version is okay. Yeah, we can do that for this tiny subset of types of applications built with this specific language with, some other restrictions placed on it. And then you expand from there.
Well, okay. I think what we did actually was we started much broader. And then we realized that we had all these customers who we had all this interest from people who just had Ruby on Rails. So we actually cut it down first to just Ruby and said, we'll expand out later. And, we'll eventually become this all-encompassing thing. And it really wasn't until 4 or 5 years later that we were that all-encompassing thing again.
Right. Okay. Yeah, well, that sounds reasonable. In other words, it is a bit more of a technical challenge than it might seem at first. You guys found a core customer base from which you could grow to that sort of 12,000 annual run or monthly run rate, was it, or whatever it was?
When we started raising in August, we were making about 8K MRR. And by the end of when we were done, I think we had like double that or something like that. And certainly the investors were keeping an eye on how much the MRR was going up during the fundraise.
Yeah, as they do.
It's sort of terrifying.
Yeah. So, how was it raising investing? Because that was like your first bigger round, right?
So this was $1.5 million that we raised. Okay. It was a seed round at the time. That's what a seed round was, and it was approaching a lot of entrepreneurs to get introductions to investors. And that was really the thing. Like people that we knew, let me pitch you on my startup. Do you know anyone who can help us out? And sometimes they would, and sometimes they wouldn't, or sometimes they wouldn't believe in what we're doing, and they wouldn't really give us any intros, or they give us like one bad intro who wouldn't meet us. And sometimes sometimes they're like, yes, I understand this, and I want to use it, and let me introduce you to this person, this person, this person. And the real sort of the thing that made that round come together was James Lindenbaum. So James is the founder of Heroku. And he is the founder also of a DevTools startup accelerator called HeavyBit, which is if you're in DevTools, you're very familiar with this. It is like it is the Y-Combinator of DevTools essentially.
Right.
And basically unbeknownst to me at the time, James was a bit of a kingmaker, and he told the investors this is going to be the CI company. You should invest in this one. And they had talked to all the other CI companies as well. And so I'm not sure exactly what I did that was, or what we did that was that, sort of separated us out from the pack. But that was the thing that really got the round together and even got the Series A together a couple of years later as well.
Okay. Now, it's not talked about very much, but once you complete a round like that and you've got this money drop into your bank account, what really happens after that? Do you go on a hiring spree? Like, what do you have to kind of figure out at that point?
We started hiring before the round was done. So when we had our first couple of 100,000 in commitments, we figured like the round is going to happen. Let's get it going. However, we didn't expect it would take 4 months. So we had 3 people start, and then we were like, oh shit, we're not going to have the money. Like, the money's not in the bank yet. We're waiting for this round to close. So we basically contacted a bunch of the early angels and said, can you give us the money now? And they wired their money with no note, no term sheet, nothing. They just like sent us the money, and that I think that was like 80K, and that was like what we needed for the 2 or 3 month salary until the round actually closed.
Okay, and how does it feel after the round closed? You got all this new staff. Do you just sort of see features rolling out so much quicker? Is it like, oh, finally we can get back to that massive list of errors that we wanted to solve? Is that kind of, is it very satisfying?
I think it just like makes things go faster, and faster is more terrifying. So we now have more customers. We now have I think the first things we started doing was like adding more monitoring over our infrastructure, sort of being able to keep an eye on what was actually happening, adding support for more things. So at the time, my job was basically doing customer support. I was answering all the emails and kind of reporting bugs and getting those bugs into getting them fixed. And so, I was just like on fire all the time. It was just like constantly having to deal with a thing over here, a thing over here, a thing over here. So yeah, I would say more than anything, raising money turns into this sort of like terrifying experience after the money comes in.
Yeah, because people don't talk much about that other than, stuff happens after, and hopefully you keep growing. Are we reaching the point soon where you decide to sort of step back as an active employee of the company, or how much longer did you stay with CircleCi?
Another 3 years. So I stayed there until 2015. Yeah, it was, I raised a Series A, which was 6 million, which at the time was a pretty decent number. Not so much anymore, but I stayed with it until we're at about like 2.5 million in revenue, and we were 25 people at around the time that I was making this decision. And we had no managers, we had there was no like middle anything. It was like me and 25 or 24 ICs, and I realized like I'm not doing a good job of this. In fact, an investor said it to me. He's like, I believe that you can do a good job of this, but you're not doing one. And I was working with a coach at the time, and I was like, I actually don't like this job. This CEO thing, this isn't fun. Like, I'm spending all my time thinking about, culture and process, and HR and, all this sort of thing. I really just like working on products. And by luck, we had acquired this company called Distiller, which did CI for iOS. And, those guys, Jim and Rob, were, better management material. So that is actually what ended up happening. Jim took over first as COO and then CEO. Rob became CTO, and they run Circle now. So they've been running Circle for, I think, nearly 6 years now.
Okay. And so how did you transition? Like, is it a case of you, because I know you make it sound like there certainly wasn't any animosity, and there's no like Twitter, like founders swapping, backstabbing each other back and forth.
No. They're. I mean, me and my co-founder had a breakup, and that there was certainly, that was a difficult time for everyone, and that was challenging. But when it came time for me to step down, like certainly. Wanted to keep a certain amount of control, and certainly had fear around like investors and that kind of thing, probably for no good reason, just the standard paranoia. But I had a lot of trust in Jim and Rob. And then when, sort of over the next few months, I stayed as CEO. Jim was effectively running the company as COO. But, the main difference was that things were a lot smoother. There was, morale was high. There wasn't a whole like revolt against the new management or everything. Just, there was just quiet, competent execution. And everyone on the team saw, okay, things are, like they were before, but more competent and more organized and, less kind of frantic.
Okay. You said you were there for this $6 million next round, your Series A.
Yeah.
What was the valuation of the company at that point?
Oh, it was like 25 million, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
At what point, because like you said at the start, today as we talk, it's been valued at 1.7 billion. Is it still private, if I'm correct, right?
It is still private, yeah.
Yeah. You've stayed, an equity owner in the company. So you've seen it go from that 20-ish million to 1.7 billion.
Yeah.
Your role has obviously become, like you said, you're more on the board now. You're a board member who's an actual user of the product, but you're not functioning as in, you're not doing the customer service. You're not being the CEO. You're not programming, all those things you used to do. It's funny how you go.
These days I'm working full time on Dark.
Right. So I'd love to talk about that too, but it's funny, the evolution. You went from being the first person to program version 1, get the first few customers, then you do a raise, you find yourself in customer service, which is probably not the best use of your strengths. But
I know, I think it actually was. I think that time spent in understanding what customers need, that was absolutely vital to making a working product.
I guess it makes sense from a startup standpoint, but it sounds like your skill set just, I can imagine if you got feedback and then you were the one who was programming the fixes. I get that, but yeah, it feels like you could put someone else there. But I also understand founders, it's great for them to stay in touch, right?
Yeah, we did switch at some point to all the engineers rotating through support, doing one day a week support each.
Yeah.
So it was only, the first year maybe that I was doing it all.
And then, like you said, you transitioned to CEO of more like a bigger company, more people. Then you tend to focus more on hiring, HR, and then you have an acquisition. You have people who are more, managerial CEO types. They take over. You step away. Couple of things. What has it been like as you stepped away to watch it grow if you're not there on a day-to-day basis? Is it kind of like watching your child grow up? Do you feel very proud? What's the feeling?
I think that's a good metaphor. It's back when I left, it was a very niche product. Still, people, certainly people used it, and certainly I had people come up to me and be like, "Oh, CircleCi, we use that." That's a much more common occurrence now. It's kind of weird. I went to some startup event recently in New York, and people not just knew about Circle, but they knew who I was, and that whole thing is a very weird situation.
Minor celebrity status. It's
very minor in a very very small niche.
Very very niche group of people. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have experienced that too at conferences, and it is always a bit. Oh yeah, you listen to my podcast or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you have a podcast too, so I know you know what that's like. I am curious about one aspect of the CircleCi experience for you, Paul. The company. I know you probably, like most startup founders, would have had a average or even below average salary as that company continued to grow, and then you sort of stepped down, and you would have watched it grow in valuation, and like everyone, you're probably thinking, what's my equity worth? At some point, you would have known my equity is now worth more money than I really need. I don't have to worry about my basic needs being met anymore. I can choose to do anything I want. What was your mindset like then, and did that influence what came next after you stepped down from your role?
So we didn't really reach that point until relatively recently. So about a year after I left Circle, I was on sabbatical, and I had budgeted. I had about 18 months of personal runway. before I was broke. I actually budgeted a bit poorly, so I was less than broke when I started Dark. But I was definitely thinking about that with all right, I'm going to have to go back to work. I need to like figure out what I'm going to do with my life. Do I want a job? Do I want a job as an engineer? Do I want to start another startup, a small startup probably? I considered starting a big startup and rejected that because I was like, the venture path, it's all like a lot of work and growth and anxiety and all that sort of thing. And so I was looking at building small startups, or getting a job as some sort of like rent a CTO or something along those lines. And in the end, I actually decided to do the big startup again. And for Dark, it's certainly the biggest idea I've ever worked on. It's both technically and in terms of the market size, it's just like a very big opportunity and very like a lot of technology that's involved in it. And I hadn't expected that I was going to go back and do that. But I think if I had been, cashed out or in a situation where I didn't really have to think about money at the time, I'm not sure that I would actually have started any job again. I might just have like sat it out
on the beach, right? With the pina colada.
I mean, I'm sure. Like, I had already gotten bored of being on the beach, but I'd probably have sat it out and just like coded and stuff.
Yeah, done what you do, what you enjoy. Okay, yeah. Well, I do want to know about Dark Lang, which I'm assuming it's like dark language. Before we dive into the technicalities of what that is, just want to clarify. So your runway was running out. You decided, okay, I'm going to do another startup, and I'm going to go venture backed. So did you kind of rinse and repeat? All right, got to find a co-founder, going to try and get into Y-Combinator, or going to try and find my first investor. Was that all the case again?
Yeah. So spent about 2 months looking for a co-founder. Did a big search. Talked to like 50 co-founders. Had a big questionnaire. All that sort of thing. Definitely.
What were you looking for?
I'm sorry.
What were you looking for? Like, what was?
I was looking for a consumer PM who could code.
Okay.
No.
Why? What was that?
Because DevTools is essentially a consumer thing. The adoption of DevTools is very much is very similar to consumer startups, and the B2B stuff is like very learnable. But the consumer and the adoption side of it, but also the reason I was looking for PM was just that the size of Dark, of what we were building was out of control. And so I felt I needed someone to help like rein that in, and to get the actual, the size of what we were building under control.
What is Dark exactly? Just for us laymen's.
So it is slightly complicated to explain what Dark is, but I think the problem that we're solving is very easy to resonate with. Like it is very hard to code. It is especially hard to build cloud services. The dealing with things like Amazon and AWS is a nightmare, and the amount of things that you need to do to get a product successfully running in the cloud and sort of scaling in the cloud it's very expensive in sort of developer time, and that is a huge problem. And so the idea we had is like, what if we could make it so that people could just start immediately building stuff in the cloud without any of that complexity, without having to deal with technologies like Amazon, obviously, but like Kubernetes, deployment and APIs. These things are all like just very, there's a lot of complexity with it. And the idea was really, how do we build without that complexity? And it was working backwards by listing out the complexity that we wanted to get rid of, and then trying to come up with a solution. So to allow people to build in the cloud with as little work as possible. And so the conclusion that we came up with is a programming language and an editor and an infrastructure all in one. So you write things in our editor, in our language, on our cloud, and if you do that, you can get instant deployments into the cloud, instant databases, not have to think about scaling or infrastructure or anything. It just works. And that meant that what Dark is as an actual product is a cloud, a programming language, and an editor. And we call it Darklang because that's the thing that sort of like gets people excited. Developers like new programming language. It's better than like Dark Cloud, although actually that wouldn't have been a bad name either.
That's a good name, yeah. Very ominous. Okay. It's reminding me as I think back to early days of blogging where I was involved when WordPress, especially the hosted version of WordPress, came along, and it was like this idea of you don't need to learn HTML. You don't need to set up your own server and rent space before cloud. You essentially open up an editor, you add images, you click publish, it goes live. That sounds similar to what you're trying to do, except for the developer of this kind of world where I want to code to create something without worrying about all the functions that make my code work, all the APIs, there's only one language, databases, infrastructure, server, all that. That sounds ambitious.
Exactly. It's for people who want to code, want to write the logic, but where the environment in which they do that now is just very inefficient.
Okay. What's the opportunity here? Like, are you trying to replace essentially every single other language and server environment out there with this?
We certainly were. Certainly, when I was pitching the seed round in 2017, it was very much like, this is going to replace AWS. This is going to replace every cloud thing that's out there, because this is just going to be something that is 100 times easier, 100 times faster to build software using this. So like, why wouldn't anyone use this? This is it's going to be the default. And so the TAM that we were pitching was just like out of this world. People didn't even question us on it. It was just like, if this works, everyone will use it. And so the thing that really came up when we were talking to investors is, will this work?
And that's still to be determined, or where are we about 4 years later now?
So we are still pre-product market fit. We released an MVP in 2019, coming up to 2 years ago, and I think that the things that we were trying to do, I think that were new. So the not having to worry about infrastructure, the instant deployment, those work, and those are quite effective. And those are the big sort of questions, like, can this be done? It's like, yes, it can be done. And so the question that we're really focusing on now is can it be good? Because it wasn't good, and it still isn't good. And the reason that it isn't good is because you come in and you use this and you're like, oh, it's super fast, very exciting. Okay, now I want to call like the Stripe API, and it's like, oh well, there's no package to use the Stripe API. There's no SDK. Okay, well, now I have to write out HTTP calls myself. That's ridiculous. I'm just going to go back to using Node or whatever, where I can type in like stripe.pay instead. Okay. And so that's the challenge that's ahead of us. But as part of doing that, where we got to the company to the point where we realized that was the problem, every time we would start to add things in that direction, we sort of got hit by shortcuts that we took earlier. So at the moment, Dark is just me, and it is just undoing all of the shortcuts and the bad decisions that we made en route to here before we start building actual new stuff out again.
Right. Yeah. It's funny as you described all that. I'm thinking this sounds a lot like the CircleCi period, where you had to bring it back to sort of focus on Ruby, and then scale up.
And with Circle, that took a month. And with Dark, that has so far taken 2 years, and will probably take another 2.
Why? Like, is it just you now? Because you did raise funding.
So we raised $3.5 million. We had the team up to about 8 people, and then we tried to raise a Series A, and we just didn't have the traction for a Series A. So we were kind of close with a couple of investors were interested, and we were relatively close to a 10 million Series A, but it didn't actually happen. So then at that point, we're spending 150K a month. We raised 2 million from our current investors and a new investor. And so we're looking at the 2 million in the bank and looking at the 150K a month that we were spending, and basically realized there was no way to get to where we needed to go spending that money. So it the end result of that was my co-founder wanted to go one way, I wanted to go the other way, and came down to a board decision. My co-founder ended up leaving, and then I laid off the rest of the team.
Okay, so we're kind of catching you at a turning point with where
Absolutely,
Dark is going. Okay, interesting. So it'd be good to keep tabs on this. It's an ambitious idea. I feel like you said, you got to find that product market fit. Like you got to find the Ruby people for this so that you can go ahead.
It's a thing that you can use today. Like you can go to darklang.com and you can sign up. And what I'm trying to do is what I'm trying to sort of adapt Dark into at the moment is making it more seem like a project than a startup. Because with a startup, you go in with very high expectations and you expect it to be in a place where, frankly, Dark is not. And so I'm trying to set the expectations low, continue to get people excited about what is enabled by Dark that doesn't exist anywhere else, because there's a lot of that, and I want people to see that. But at the same time, I want people to know this is not something that you're going to be building your startup on. This has a lot of rough edges, but hope that people can see the potential.
Okay, and is that because you want to kind of open source it, where your community will help you build it, or not?
A little bit. So we're not open sourcing it. It is source available. There's a whole thing in the industry at the moment about your open source infrastructure stuff, and then Amazon runs it, and then I mentioned earlier how the money to sustain DevTools startups is often in the infrastructure and charging for it. You can't do that if Amazon's the one who's actually running it and getting the money for it. So a lot of focus has been on how to make Dark sustainable, both financially, but also from a community perspective. So we made it source available. People do contribute every now and then. It hasn't been at a point where people can contribute because there is a large technology rewrite going on. But I expect that when that's done, the contributions will start picking up again, and it will be. I'm certainly aiming it at being a community project where people are contributing and they're participating, and we are running the infrastructure, supporting all that.
Okay, and maybe I shouldn't ask you this, but did the Y-Combinator second trip where you got kicked out tie into this?
Did it? No, it wasn't really. That was all about the vaccines. So I tweeted about a couple of people in Y-Combinator had told others how to get vaccines that in one case they definitely weren't entitled to, and in another case it was a little more vague. And I tweeted about that because that's unethical as shit. And simultaneously, or along the same lines, there was some discussion internally where I had aired some grievances where I felt that Y-Combinator was, I think the way I put it is I'd fallen out of love with Y-Combinator, and
just to clarify though, Paul, were you in Y-Combinator with Dark? Was that
no? So this was an alumni. So when you go through Y-Combinator, you're part of the community. There's a sort of a private social network and Slack group and all that sort of thing.
So you weren't in a batch.
I wasn't in a batch. No. I got kicked out of the community.
Right. You got ostracized from Y-Combinator land.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, all right. I can see where this is going. You have ideological disagreements around things, and
Right. When you don't like what something has become, but you're still part of it, and it's still useful, and you're vaguely flailing to try to make it better, and someone realizes that you're actually just being disruptive in the community. It's okay, yeah, I can totally see it.
Yeah. Okay, so just to kind of wrap this up, probably a good time to sort of finish up. Dark, I can tell, feels very much like something where you see a vision for something pretty big. While you were building that over the last 4 years, and obviously you went through co-founder and initial funding, and then scaled back, and it switched from being a startup to a project, like you said. While that's all happening, CircleCi is going from its 20 million to its $1.7 billion valuation. Is that would you have considered, let me sell some of my shares in that on the secondary market so I can put it into Dark? I know that's very risky, putting probably your biggest source of net worth into a project. Did that cross your mind at all?
Yeah, I mean,
where are you now with all this?
So, Dark still has money. When we run out of money, it's going to be up to me to fund. I'm the biggest owner of Dark. And this is a thing that I'm going to be working on for the next 10, 20 years. I'm convinced that it works. I think that other people who use it can see how it will work as well. But it's going to take time. I think the most likely thing is that I expand the team to sort of 3 other engineers maybe. And over the next 2 years, bring it to something which is, which actually has product market fit. And, if we run out of money on the way, then that'll be up to me to fund it, I think.
Okay. So you may consider taking some of your Circle equity, and depending on what happens with Circle, of course, if they become a listed company, it becomes easier for you to do that and so on.
Right. And I've sold some secondary already. So certainly I'm viewing this as a place where they're probably, just despite the frothiness of the markets, Dark is not in a very strong position to fundraise. So need to get it to somewhere where it's in a good position to fundraise again, and or to be cash flow positive. Hard to see where things are going to be in 2 years, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you have those paying members again, or some sort of income source
exactly.
from it, it makes
the thing I'm thinking about at the moment is we're not going to get a whole lot of usage out of it. Like if we charge you for usage, you would pay far more than you would on AWS or something like that. And so probably a membership fee of standard user pricing is much more palatable these days. So some sort of it's free for something, and it's paid for something else, standard sort of like SaaS-y kind of thing, is probably how that's going to end up.
Okay, great. Paul, I've taken a lot of your time. I maybe wrap up with one last question that I am curious about. So you've certainly had a variety of experiences here. You've been an early CEO, co-founder of what's become a unicorn. You've seen also when it was time for you to step away, which takes some consciousness about what you're doing and what your skill sets are. And you've then dived into an ambitious project that, again, clearly taps into your skill set. I can see the overlap. It's like expanding what CircleCi kind of was to the entire technological framework. But it's, it's bumpy. You're trying to figure out the use case and make it work for scale and potentially funding. And even prior to that, you've been an academic. So you know the really in the trenches coding for the sake of just expanding on ideas and language and so on. My question out of all of this is, especially for those listening who are technical founders, like they're like you, they have engineering capabilities, they've wanted to, or even currently are building their own something technical as a startup or as a project, but more likely a startup. I'm really curious, what, from your point of view, is actually the hardest part to make that work as when you are a technical person coming into a startup?
There's a tendency of engineers to sort of build it and they will come. And I think that's especially true in DevTools. I think it is maybe becoming less true in other areas, but in DevTools, you often hear people, it just needs a little more before I launch it or whatever. And this is especially true in sort of like the community first side of things, where people build an open source project and then try to turn that into something later. So the sort of advice that I give earlier founders is to sort of like put the keyboard away and, go out and talk to humans and go out and talk to like actual users and get people to try and use it and try to, actually understand what is needed to get this thing to product market fit. And just to have this sort of like relentless focus on what actually is product market fit for you and how do you get to that? Because like really, nothing else matters. And in fact, you sometimes see people skip product market fit and manage to like raise without it. And that ends up being a complete disaster. So really like pointing people towards that focusing on product market fit.
Mm. It's interesting. It's the same advice you probably give every single founder out there, really, right? It doesn't matter if you're technical or not technical. Product market fit is the most important thing.
Well, the non-technical founders tend to have their eye on that a lot more than the technical founders.
Yeah, makes sense. Especially when you're capable of building something. Yeah, it's different than being the marketing person where you've got to find customers and get sales or something like that. So, right. Paul, thank you for sharing the full story. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Yeah. Where can we send people to? Obviously, your current projects.
Yeah, so you should check out darklang.com and I guess follow me on Twitter, Paul Biggar. Okay,
we'll share those links with the show notes. We'll keep on track with Dark. They could be huge, so we'll look forward to following you and obviously CircleCi. Great success. Congratulations on that one. That's obviously a nice. You've got that forever badge where you can say you built a unicorn. So that's obviously that opens doors no matter what you do. Yeah. So well done.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Paul.